Spring 1945. Somewhere near the Rhine. The war was ending the way an avalanche ends, with silence after destruction. Villages lay hollowed, rivers carried more wreckage than water, and smoke drifted through the forests like a ghost refusing to leave. Among the scattered ruins stood a requisitioned farmhouse, its windows boarded, its walls marked with chalk symbols that meant only one thing: quarters for female civilians. Inside, 23 women huddled in the dim light of kerosene lamps. Some were widows, some were nurses. Some, like Clara Vogel, aged 25, had been seized from bomb shelters and pressed into comfort service for the crumbling German command. For months they had survived on fear, rumour, and whatever rations the soldiers tossed their way. They heard the front collapsing, the Allies advancing, the gunfire inching closer each night. And then, one morning, the gunfire stopped. At dawn, a jeep rolled up the muddy path, followed by 2 US trucks painted olive drab. American soldiers stepped out, helmets low, rifles slung but not raised. The women froze behind the slats of the shuttered window. "Americana," someone whispered. Clara's stomach twisted. She remembered what the others had told her, that captured women were humiliated, stripped and photographed, that surrender meant shame. The door creaked open. An American sergeant stood in the frame, tall, dust-covered, eyes scanning but not hungry. He removed his helmet. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Is anyone hurt?" No one answered. The women pressed closer to the walls, waiting for commands, for orders, for laughter that always came before cruelty. Instead, the sergeant turned to his men. "Clear the outer rooms, set guards. Nobody goes inside without my say-so. Understood?" The soldiers nodded. One of them laid down a small Red Cross satchel by the door. Medical support. Lies, not weapons. Clara blinked. "They're not here to hurt us." Hours passed. The Americans set up a perimeter, marking off the farmhouse as civilian protected zone. They posted a sign in English and broken German. "No entry. Women under care." That night the soldiers camped 50 yards away. No one crossed the boundary. Not one. Inside, the women whispered in disbelief. "They didn't even look at us," muttered Liesel, the oldest among them. "Not once." "They'll come later," another said. "They always come later." But they never did. Instead, every morning, a young medic named Corporal James Harper knocked once on the doorframe before entering. He kept his gaze low, voice calm. He brought tins of soup, bandages, and sometimes a small radio that played Glenn Miller through static. He spoke simple German. Essen, Doktor, Hilfe. Then he left. Clara couldn't understand it. She had prepared herself for degradation, not decency. One afternoon, as the rain drummed against the roof, Harper arrived carrying folded cloth. "New dresses," he said awkwardly, "found in town, clean." The women stared. The dresses were plain but whole, cotton, not uniform scraps. Clara stepped forward hesitantly. "Why, you give this?" He shrugged. "Because you deserve better than rags." She searched his face for sarcasm and found none, just weariness, the same kind she saw in her own reflection. Days turned to weeks. The Americans treated the farmhouse like sacred ground. They rebuilt its fence, fixed the pump, even planted tulips by the path. When photographers came to document the rehabilitation effort, the sergeant refused them entry. "No pictures," he said firmly. "These women have done their share of being looked at." The journalists protested. "But sir, the papers." He cut them off. "Write about mercy, then. Leave their faces out of it." At night, the women sat by the small radio and listened to the war's aftermath unfold. Germany's surrender, Hitler's death, the liberation of camps they hadn't known existed. Clara found herself weeping, not from grief, but from something stranger, the slow realization that she was safe. One evening she stepped outside, the first time in months. The moonlight turned the barbed wire silver. A soldier on watch nodded politely, then looked away to give her space. She whispered, "Danke." He answered softly, "You're welcome, ma'am." That single word, ma'am, felt like a blanket around her shame. In late May, orders came down. The women were to be transferred to a Red Cross recovery center. Trucks arrived at dawn. As they climbed aboard, Harper handed each woman a folded paper. Clara unfolded hers. It was a simple note. "No one can give back what was taken, but maybe we can give you privacy to begin again." She held it to her chest as the truck rumbled away. The convoy stopped in a nearby village to rest. As Clara looked out the window, she saw townspeople glaring, calling them traitors, collaborators. She lowered her eyes. But one American jeep followed behind, its flag snapping in the wind. And for the first time, the insults didn't sink as deep. The sound of boots and rifles no longer meant fear. It meant someone was standing between her and the world's judgment. That night, the women slept in clean cots for the first time. Nurses offered them soap and notebooks to write what they remember. Clara stared at the blank page for a long time before writing a single line. "They did not touch us. They let us be human." She stopped there. It was enough. Summer, 1945, near Kassel, American-occupied Germany. The war was officially over, but peace hadn't yet found its voice. Cities smoldered quietly, churches had no bells left to ring, and the rivers carried more memory than reflection. At a makeshift Allied rehabilitation center, the air smelled faintly of soap and burnt wood, the two scents of post-war survival. It was here that Clara Vogel found herself, one of 50 women sheltered under Red Cross care. The center had once been a school. Now its chalkboards bore lists of names, women, ages, and vague notes like malnourished or psychological distress. Most didn't speak much. Some hadn't spoken at all since their release. But every morning someone left a small bouquet of wildflowers on the table in the dining room, tied with a string, never with a name. Clara suspected it was Corporal Harper, though she hadn't seen him since their transfer weeks ago. The Americans rotated posts quickly now, moving from one ruined town to another, trying to make order from ash. Still, she kept his note folded inside her coat pocket. "No one can give back what was taken, but maybe we can give you privacy to begin again." Privacy, a small word, but after years of being property, it felt like a prayer. One afternoon, a Red Cross nurse named Margaret Leland called Clara into the classroom that now served as an office. "Miss Vogel," she said gently, "we're offering positions to some of the women who are strong enough. Clerical work, translation, supply records. You speak English, yes?" Clara nodded. "A little. I learned from the soldiers." Margaret smiled. "Then you'll do just fine." That evening, Clara sat by the window as the sun bled through the broken glass. She could still see herself as she was months ago, dirty, hollow-eyed, trembling whenever boots echoed nearby. Now she wore clean clothes, ate warm soup, and carried a pencil instead of fear. She thought about Harper again, about the way he never looked too long, never asked questions that weren't his to ask. In a world that had taken her dignity piece by piece, he had given back silence, the kind that protected, not punished. Weeks turned to months. The rehabilitation center began to resemble something almost human again. The women tended a garden, taught each other sewing, and learned to smile without flinching. But outside those walls, the world wasn't ready to forgive. When they walked to town for supplies, locals whispered, "Comfort girls. Collaborators. Shame to Germany." A man spat near their feet once. "You fed the enemy," he sneered. Clara's hands trembled, but she didn't reply. There was nothing to say. Inside the market, an elderly woman approached her, face lined, eyes weary. "You were one of them?" she asked quietly. Clara lowered her gaze. "I was taken. We all were." The old woman hesitated, then pressed an apple into her hand. "Then you were victims, not traitors. Don't let them decide your name." Clara almost cried right there, but she didn't. Instead, she walked back to the center, holding the apple like it was proof that kindness could still exist among ruins. That night, as the women gathered for evening tea, Margaret entered the hall with a stack of envelopes. "Mail call," she announced cheerfully. No one expected anything. Most had no one left. But when Margaret called, "Miss Clara Vogel," silence fell. Clara froze. Her heart thudded as she took the envelope. The handwriting was neat but familiar. English, straight lines, soldier's penmanship. She tore it open carefully. "Dear Miss Vogel, you probably don't remember me among all the uniforms, but I was stationed near your farmhouse, James Harper. They moved us east after your transport. I didn't want to write, but I kept thinking about what your sergeant said, that mercy has no paperwork, so it disappears unless we write it down. I wanted to tell you something. The men in my unit talked about that house for weeks, how we guarded it but never entered. Some said it was the first time they felt proud since the war began. We'd seen too much ruin, too many women treated like spoils. You reminded us that we were still capable of restraint, of decency. If this letter reaches you, know this. The world will try to define you by what was done to you. Don't let them. You survived, and that makes you the strongest person I ever met. Yours with respect, James." The room blurred. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, trembling. She whispered his name, James, like a secret only the wind should hear. From that day, Clara began to write again. Not reports, but stories. Short, quiet pieces about war and recovery, about flowers growing where tanks had passed. She never mentioned names, only moments. The Red Cross eventually sent her to Berlin to help translate during the Nuremberg follow-up trials. There she met journalists, aid workers, even psychologists who wanted to study the comfort women phenomenon. But when they asked for details, for how it felt, for what happened, she refused to speak. "I don't owe the world my pain," she said calmly, "only my truth." And her truth was this: not every uniform meant cruelty. In 1948, she received another letter, this one from Virginia, USA. Clara. "I'm home now. Married, 2 kids. Life's different. But sometimes when the wind comes through the wheat, I remember the women at the farmhouse and hope you found peace. The war tried to make us monsters, and maybe what happened there proved we didn't all become one. If you ever come to America, look for the light on the porch. It'll be for you." She read it twice, then smiled. It wasn't romance, it wasn't confession. It was acknowledgement, something far rarer. By 1952, Clara's writings were being circulated among aid groups and nurses. Her essays carried no bitterness, only reflection. One line was printed in a Red Cross journal and later quoted in several post-war lectures. Some men fought wars to conquer, others fought to remember they were still human. No one knew who had written it. Clara preferred it that way. Years later, she visited that same farmhouse, or what was left of it. The roof was gone, the walls cracked with ivy. She placed fresh tulips on the old doorstep. In her pocket was Harper's first note, worn soft from years of folding and unfolding. "Maybe we can give you privacy to begin again." She smiled faintly. "You did," she whispered. "And I did." When she died in 1983, her daughter found a wooden box among her things. Inside were 3 letters, a pressed tulip, and a single line written on parchment. Respect was the first kindness I believed in again. Autumn, 1972. Frankfurt, West Germany. The city had changed beyond recognition. Glass towers rose where bunkers once stood. The hum of traffic replaced the echoes of marching boots. Young people wore denim and carried protest signs, not rifles. Yet for Clara Vogel, every mirror still carried two reflections, the woman she was and the one the war had made her become. She was now 52, working quietly as a librarian at the Goethe Institute. Her grey hair was always pinned neatly, her hands still faintly scarred from the burns of wartime antiseptic. The staff called her Frau Vogel, and to them she was simply a kind, reserved woman who read poetry during lunch breaks and smiled when children visited. None of them knew that once, decades ago, she had been labelled something far less innocent, a comfort woman. In the evenings, after closing the library, Clara would walk home through the rain-slick streets, past the rebuilt squares and American-owned shops that had replaced bombed ruins. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same nation that had defeated her country now sold it typewriters, records, and Coca-Cola. But she didn't resent it. The Americans had given her something Germany never had after the war: dignity. That word, dignity, had been her anchor for almost 3 decades. It was why she still kept every letter from Corporal James Harper tucked inside a book of German poems. She never replied again after his last note from Virginia, but she reread them every year on the same date, May the 9th, the day she first tasted freedom. She would whisper his words like a prayer. The world will try to define you by what was done to you. Don't let them. December 1972. A young American researcher named Emily Harper arrived at the Institute. She was 26, confident but gentle, with the same warm eyes and slight southern drawl that immediately stopped Clara in his tracks. During introductions, Emily smiled and said, "I'm here doing a paper on post-war humanitarian recovery. My grandfather served in the U.S. Army Medical Corps in Germany. He used to tell us stories about helping civilians after the war." Clara's heartbeat quickened. "What was his name?" "James Harper," Emily replied. "He passed away a few years ago. My grandmother still keeps his journals. He wrote a lot about mercy, I think." Clara's vision blurred for a moment. The air in the room seemed to thicken, full of ghosts and gratitude. "Your grandfather," she said softly, "was a good man." Emily tilted her head. "You knew him?" Clara hesitated. Then quietly, "Once, when I was very young, he gave me back something I didn't know could be returned." Emily frowned gently. "Forgiveness?" Clara smiled faintly. "Privacy." That evening they sat together in the quiet reading room after everyone else had gone home. Clara told her the story, not with dramatics or tears, but with the calm rhythm of a woman who had finally made peace with her memories. She described the farmhouse, the soldiers' restraint, the note that had restored her faith in men, and how the Americans had stood guard not over prisoners, but over dignity itself. Emily listened, wide-eyed. "He never said your name," she whispered, "only that there was a woman who reminded him that mercy was stronger than victory." Clara's eyes filled, though her voice stayed steady. Then he remembered the only part that mattered. A few weeks later, Emily brought a small leather-bound journal to the library. It was worn, the pages yellowed, the handwriting sharp and deliberate. "Grandpa's field diary," she said. "He wrote this near Kassel, spring 45. I think you should see it." Clara turned the pages slowly, trembling. She recognized the tone immediately, that same disciplined compassion. Then she found the passage. "Farmhouse occupied by civilian women, presumed abused by retreating forces. Issued order, no photography, no entry without consent. Men complied without resistance. Strange, in this single act of restraint, I felt more like a soldier than in all the battles before. Humanity feels like surrender sometimes. Clara closed her eyes, clutching the book to her chest. He never forgot, she whispered. Emily placed her hand gently over hers. Neither did you. In the months that followed, Emily convinced Clara to record her story for a Red Cross archival project documenting acts of compassion during the occupation. Clara hesitated at first. The word comfort woman still felt like barbed wire in her mouth. But Emily promised her, it's not confession, it's history, and history without mercy is incomplete. So, one spring afternoon in 1973, Clara sat before a microphone in a small Frankfurt studio and told her story, not of victimhood, but of survival through decency. Her voice never trembled. She spoke of boundaries honored, of silence respected, of men who understood that mercy didn't require apologies, only discipline. They didn't save us with food or medicine, she said. They saved us with distance. And sometimes that's the only kind of salvation the wounded can bear. The recording circulated quietly through Red Cross circles and academic archives. It was never broadcast, but it found its way into the hands of post-war researchers, chaplains, and even soldiers in Vietnam. Some said it changed how they treated local civilians. Others said it reminded them that mercy could be masculine too. Clara never sought recognition. But she began receiving anonymous letters from women who had heard the story and finally found courage to speak of their own. One read, "You made me realize I'm not shame, I'm survival." She kept them all in the same wooden box as Harper's letters. Winter, 1980. Clara grew frailer but more peaceful. Emily visited often, sometimes bringing her children, James and Margaret. She laughed softly at the coincidence. Your grandfather would have liked that, Clara said. One evening, as the first snow fell, Emily found her gazing out the window, a faint smile on her face. Do you ever regret telling your story? She asked. Clara shook her head. No, silence protects shame, but truth protects memory. I wanted to protect his memory, and mine. She looked at the old tulip plant by her window, grown from bulbs she had planted the year she first met him. You know, she said quietly, he once said the world will define you by what was done to you. I think the trick is to define yourself by what you refused to do back. When Clara died 3 years later, the library closed for one day in her honor. Emily, now a professor of humanitarian ethics, delivered the eulogy. She once told me mercy is a discipline, not a gift, Emily said to the gathered crowd. And in the middle of war, she found men disciplined enough to practice it. Clara was buried under a cherry tree in a quiet Frankfurt cemetery. Her gravestone bore no title, no dates of war service, only a simple engraving in German and English. Respected, remembered, free. At the funeral, Emily placed her grandfather's field journal beside the casket. He'd have wanted you to have the last word, she whispered. Epilogue, 2015. A museum exhibit in Berlin titled Mercy in Wartime, The Forgotten Acts of WWII opened to record crowds. Among the letters, uniforms, and ration books was a small glass case displaying 2 artifacts side by side. A folded note reading, "Maybe we can give you privacy to begin again." A Red Cross audio recording labeled K. Vogel, Kassel Rehabilitation, 1945. Visitors often paused their longest. Some wept quietly, others simply nodded, as if understanding something too deep for WWII to. A small plaque beneath it read, "In memory of those who discovered that even in war, respect can be an act of rebellion."